All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already done so. It is National Clean Energy Week, and we are honored to see all of you here in the Zoom room with us today. We have an incredible panel lined up for you, and it's our hope that you leave this discussion with some new ideas about bioenergy's potential to be a climate solution, and also its potential to bring benefits to our communities, the water, the air, and our soils. As we think and talk about the land, it's important to remember the people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. The two main universities represented by our speakers today are the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Michigan State University. UW-Madison occupies ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Ho-Chunk people, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede the territory, and yet they remain here, active and present. MSU occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. The university resides on lands ceded in an 1819 treaty. We want to recognize that these nations and Indigenous peoples in the Midwest and all over the world are doing some of the most crucial and leading work on the transition away from fossil fuels. There is an incredible wealth of knowledge among you all here today. Please take advantage of our panelists and the expertise in the audience by making use of the Q&A and chat features in Zoom. In the Q&A feature, you'll have the opportunity to upvote questions that you'd like to see answered by our panelists. This discussion will be recorded and shared on our YouTube after the event. And lastly, closed captions are enabled, so you can turn them on or off at the live transcript button on the bottom of your screen. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Adriana Trusiak, your moderator for the night. Dr. Trusiak is a research coordinator for the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center located at Michigan State University. Over to you, Adriana.
Thank you, Allison, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Power from Plants, How Bioenergy Benefits the World panel. The panel is organized by the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, which we'll also refer to as GLBRC. GLBRC is a Department of Energy-funded bioenergy research center based at University of Wisconsin-Madison, with partners across the US and Canada, including Michigan State University. The focus of GLBRC is to create fuels and products from plants in economically viable and environmentally sustainable ways. Today, we'll focus on sustainability and discuss how bioenergy can help meet our energy needs without compromising the future. We have a great panel of experts, as Allison has mentioned, with us today, and they're all GLB researchers. Our experts include Professor Phil Robertson, University Distinguished Professor of Ecosystem Science in the Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences at Michigan State University. Cheyenne Lay, a doctoral candidate in the Landscape Ecology and Ecosystems Lab at Michigan State University. Dr. Carmella Vitza, a postdoctoral research associate at Washington State University. Dr. Mauricio Nieves, a Kijkstra postdoctoral fellow at GLBRC. Ali Zahorek, a doctoral candidate in entomology at Michigan State University. And Dr. Tyler Lark, an assistant scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment. Thank you all for being here with us tonight and sharing your expertise. With that, we'll start with a short overview of bioenergy and sustainability by Professor Robertson. As Allison said, please send your questions using the question or chat feature. And with that, take it away, Phil.
Well, thanks, Adriana, and welcome everyone. I'm Phil Robertson. As Adriana mentioned, I'm a GLBRC, a Great Lakes bioenergy scientist at Michigan State University, working on issues related to bioenergy sustainability for a number of years now. And I want to start I want to set the stage for this evening's discussion with a few slides to get us thinking about some of the big issues ahead of us and how bioenergy can help to meet that. So I'm going to share my screen here. You'll bear with me for a second. And hope that that's projecting.
That looks great.
Okay, great. So I would expect that, most of you today are aware of the climate change challenge that today the world is about 1 degree warmer, 1 degree centigrade warmer than in pre-industrial times, as illustrated in this upper left graph, the second ball from the left. And that with current rates of greenhouse gas emissions, we're headed towards a 1.5 degrees C world sometime by mid-century, and even warmer thereafter. With corrective action, though, we can bring the temperature down to 1.5 degrees and keep it there, perhaps indefinitely, perhaps even lower, and thereby avoid the super extreme effects of climate change. Not that 1 degree C where we are today is not, isn't too extreme. So what is this corrective action? Well, that's illustrated in the right-hand figure, which describes different ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions through the end of the century to achieve only a 1.5 degrees C warmer world. On the far left part of this graph is today's carbon dioxide emissions. And all of the models that are used to predict future temperature based on greenhouse gas emissions through the century. And these are the same models that have done an excellent job at predicting today's CO2, the effects of today's CO2 emissions, predict that by mid-century, we must be carbon neutral in order to get to that 1.5 degree C target. You can see where the lines on this graph cross the zero net CO2 emissions. And there's quite a bit of latitude depending on the strategy that we adopt to get there. But the main point here is that we need to get to carbon neutrality by sometime mid-century in order to make this work. But more than that, by the end of the century, we must be removing CO2 from the atmosphere, so-called negative emissions, with the amount needed to be removed dependent on the amount of overshoot that happens on the way there, the amount of excess CO2 or CO2 that is emitted prior to our getting to net neutral, which is largely dependent on how long we delay acting. Now, if we look at how we're going to be able to remove CO2, there are limited options. And there are no silver bullets. No magic CO2 scrubbers are on the horizon. In fact, the only known technologies for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere are plant-based. Should say removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at scale. It's easy enough to remove CO2 from the atmosphere on a lab bench or even in a prototype fan system, but removing it at scale from a pool that's as large as the atmosphere is a really daunting process. Using plants to do this, though, should come as no surprise. Plants have been doing this for billions of years. And these plant-based strategies fall into two main categories. The first is natural climate solutions, which are called that because they are nature-based solutions that include reforestation, wetland restoration, and farming in a way that releases or captures carbon dioxide in soil. And cellulosic bioenergy, which turns CO2 into plant biomass, into carbon compounds that can be used as a fuel instead of fossil carbon, thereby avoiding fossil fuel use. And when the fuel is made or burned in an engine, for example, the CO2 emitted were stored underground in geologic formations as carbon, which is sometimes called carbon capture and storage. And in that way, the bioenergy could create negative emissions. So let's look at how much is needed to meet a 1.5 degree C end of century target. The graph here in the middle of this slide takes one of the mitigation scenarios from the prior slide and shows where the CO2 removal can come from. Now, some portion, the portion in the green, can come from the natural climate solutions, the carbon dioxide that's stored in trees and reforestation, or the carbon dioxide that's stored as soil carbon with wetland restoration, and in trees with wetland restoration, or in soil with zero carbon farming, such as no-till technology. And some portion, a greater portion, as you can see, will be captured, could be captured by BECCS, this bioenergy carbon capture and storage solution. Both of these are important, and the relative amounts are, they're not speculative, but they're modeled. They have different model assumptions behind them. And so the proportion here, may differ over the course of learning more about each of these different processes. But the basic notion here is that plants will do a much better job of removing CO2 from the atmosphere at reasonable cost than most every other technology that's currently on the drawing boards. And the net result is that we achieve CO2 removal from the atmosphere, not simply neutrality. Bioenergy can help us to get to neutrality by allowing us to avoid fossil fuel use for transportation, for example. But the main value post conversion to a carbon neutral economy is CO2 removal. And this has to start happening soon, which is the other takeaway from this graph. We're looking at the need to get to carbon neutrality within the next 30 to 40 years, which is a pretty daunting a pretty daunting challenge. So I can't see from faces, so I don't know if your eyes have turned glassy at this point, but I'm going to forge ahead here with two more slides. The first, I want to describe, making transportation fuels from biomass, which is, using biomass as a gasoline substitute is tricky but tractable. And keep in mind that I'm talking here about using cellulosic biomass, not grain biomass. Currently, grain biomass is providing about 10% of our current gasoline mixes. When you buy gasoline at the pump, about 10% of that is ethanol, which comes from corn grain. And we're not talking about that kind of ethanol. We're talking about ethanol that, or some other hydrocarbon that is produced from growing plants, which is on the left side of this diagram, and then converting them using microbes to convert their biomass, the lignins and polysaccharides like cellulose, into hydrocarbons that can be put into a gas tank or converted to plastics or some other product that we currently use fossil fuel for. And the trick is that this must be done sustainably in order to have a real climate benefit. In other words, if you use just as much fossil energy to grow the plants or to convert them to fuel as is contained in the biomass itself, then there's no climate benefit. And that's a problem with current grain ethanol, and that there's so much fossil fuel embedded in the fertilizer and fuel and other sources of farming inputs that grain-based ethanol is only about 20% better than gasoline relative to for the climate. Unlike cellulosic bioenergy, which can have over 100% better climate benefit than gasoline, and even greater than 100%, meaning that it's net negative. So Great Lakes Bioenergy is aimed in part at making sure the whole product stream is sustainable. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we have to be mindful of a number of environmental issues when we think about growing this much biomass for bioenergy. And we're talking about millions of acres, tens of millions of acres of biomass, of land needed for this. We need to be considering what the land was used for before growing bioenergy crops. If it was a forest, cutting down the forest could itself release more CO2 than the CO2 benefit of 50 years of bioenergy production. So the creation of carbon debt when we convert carbon dense lands to bioenergy use is a big problem, and therefore we need to avoid carbon dense lands for growing this. We also need to avoid land that's currently used for food, to avoid food fuel conflict, as well as to avoid what are called indirect land use effects when we substitute bioenergy for food in one part of the globe, which creates a demand for additional food globally, and therefore more land clearing, and therefore more potential climate harm. And so we need to be very careful about the land use that we use. We also need to be considerate of crop choice. What crops do we grow? Some are more carbon beneficial than others. Some have other effects that we may want to encourage, such as the biodiversity impacts of the systems that we end up using. Will the crops harm or benefit pollinators or butterflies or birds or many of the other taxa that we depend on and appreciate? Will fertilizer nitrogen be required and thereby impact from a water quality standpoint the environment? How much more water will be used, if any? And how much land is needed? Is there enough for what we need to produce? So all of these considerations and others must be confronted if we're to create sustainable bioenergy solutions. And that's a good part of what we're about in Great Lakes Bioenergy, together with other researchers across the US. So I'm going to stop here so that we can hear from others on the panel. And thank you for listening to this point. And Adriana, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Phil. That was a great overview. And actually, we'll go now to our panelists, because what Phil introduced with these ecological considerations for biofuels is our panelists are focusing on different aspects of these. So before we go to the audience questions, which we already have quite a bit of questions, I would like each panelist to just introduce your research area and how do you answer the question of how is bioenergy benefiting the world with relevance to your research area or your area of expertise. And we'll start with Cheyenne Lay.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Cheyenne Lay, and as mentioned before, I'm a doctoral candidate within the Michigan State University. And my research focuses on atmospheric physics, agriculture, ecology, and work with albedo, which is the ratio of sunlight reflected from a surface compared to the amount of sunlight incident upon it. So I analyze relationships of albedo on biofuel crops, especially across years and temporally across seasons, such as the growing season, winter, spring, and harvest. And from here, we model global warming potentials and the impacts of that albedo and how different factors in biofuel crops, such as plant phenology, growth, and agronomic activities all affect climate warming and cooling. As we are all here, bioenergy is very important to agriculture and in turn affects the policies that we make, where we plant, and what species we lean towards. And being able to tap into that information using sensors at multiple scales, such as instantaneous measurements, which a farmer could do on his own, continuous measurements such as an eddy covariance or an albedo tower, which provide long-term and continuous measurements for understanding small and large-scale changes, as well as on a large scale through drones and satellites, where we can observe regional to national changes in bioenergy on the landscape. So my research is pretty important in understanding how these biofuel crops, ranging from annual row crops of maize to perennials to switchgrass and miscanthus to large swaths of forest or even poplar, can provide cooling effects on the landscape and help provide cooling on the long term.
Thank you, Cheyenne. And I'll just chime in and say that a lot of the audience, you might be familiar with hearing about albedo when we talk about the ice sheets, because white ice sheets reflect a lot of heat from the surface, and as they're melting, more heat is absorbed. But albedo doesn't only refer to ice as it's usually covered, but you can study it in the crops as well, which is really cool. Next up, we have Carmella Vitza.
Thanks everyone for coming tonight. My name is Carmella Vitza. I'm a postdoc at Washington State University, and I work half of the year during fieldwork season when the grass is green at Kellogg Biological Station, which is part of Michigan State University. And I'm really interested in switchgrass, which is a perennial grass that's also a candidate for biofuel crops. And the things that I'm thinking about are the microbial processes in the soil. Specifically, I'm thinking about nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is that process where microbial organisms are essentially able to take nitrogen gas, which is really abundant in the atmosphere, but is usually not accessible to most organisms. And they can break that energetically expensive triple bond between two nitrogen atoms and make it accessible for themselves as well as plants. And we know a lot about this process in legumes, but we know less about it in perennial grasses. And so I'm thinking a lot about how precipitation and drought can influence this process. And I'm also trying to understand when it's occurring and how we can maximize its use.
Great. Thank you, Carmella. And just a reminder, in addition to focusing about carbon cycle, we think about all these other processes that are happening in soils and might influence the sustainability of growing biofuels. Next up is Ali Zahorek.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Allison, or Ali Zahorek. I am a PhD candidate at Michigan State University. And I am an entomologist, which is I study insects and other tiny creatures, as well as ecology, which is really concerned with the interactions of living things and how they are interacting with one another, as well as the environment. And I'm really interested in looking at that in more of a bioenergy cropping system context. So we know that with this push for more renewable energies, we're going to be having these bioenergy crops taking up more and more of the landscape. So in order for that to be done sustainably, we really need to have a good understanding of how having these crops being grown on the landscape is influencing not just the species and organisms that are already living here out in the landscape in the Midwest and in other regions. So like what kind of impacts that's going to be having on how they are, those communities are assembled, and also other environmental processes that are really important for these ecosystems functioning. So my specific area of research currently is looking at soil animals that are living in the soils underneath these bioenergy cropping systems. So tiny insects, as well as mites and other soil fauna. And I'm really interested in seeing, one, how are the ways that we're growing bioenergy crops, as well as what different types of crops we're growing, how we're managing them, is influencing these communities of soil organisms, as well as looking to see how that's influencing the really important processes that these organisms are carrying out. So we know that they have roles in nitrogen and carbon cycling, which is really important for both plant growth and also keeping carbon in soils where we want it rather than the atmosphere. So overall, my research really kind of delves in with that. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ali. Next, we have Mauricio Tejera Nieves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mauricio. I'm very excited to be here and have the opportunity to talk with other people about their thoughts about bioenergy. So I'm a plant physiologist by formation. I now study the physiology of perennial grasses that, as we were talking about, they're very important. They have a very important role in the bioenergy economy. And I'm very interested in how these long-living organisms respond to the environment and how they respond to time, which we don't think about time as a factor. But this may sound weird, but what I'm very interested is about aging in perennial plants. Can we tell what are these physiological changes that are very clear to see in people? Like we can see a person and say, well, this is older or younger than this other one, but what happened with plants? So that's the focus of my research. And then about how bioenergy benefits people. From my personal perspective, I think there are two main venues for this. One, I think, is in the economy. I think that locally produced energy, it has the potential to boost local economies. And then from the environment, I think that these fast-growing plants that we want them to be big and tall so we can get a lot of energy, they also need a lot of a very large rooting system. And that's carbon that is sequestered in the soil. So that has itself a lot of benefits in the environment. And also when we plant these plants, strategically in the field, we have the opportunity to boost the entire, all the benefits, the environmental benefits of the entire agricultural land.
Great. Thank you, Mauricio. And last but not least, we have Tyler Lark.
Thanks, Adriana. So I'm an agricultural geographer and land system scientist, and I study U.S. agricultural land use and land use change. So the lens that I'm coming at bioenergy from is looking at on our landscapes, how we use land currently for croplands, agriculture, all the different applications, and where bioenergy might fit into that picture. And so through that lens, I've seen challenges of bioenergy, but a lot of the opportunity. And so what I get really excited about is the potential for these next generation cellulosic biofuel feedstocks to really add perenniality back to the landscape. It's an opportunity to bring and reintroduce new levels of biodiversity or restore levels of biodiversity, improve carbon sequestration, water quality, provide potentially wildlife habitat, and just a whole slew of potential benefits when bioenergy is done right. And so I think it offers a huge opportunity that we want to be thinking about and implement in a good way.
Great, thank you, Tyler. So first, I would like to address a question that came up a few times. And to be honest, this is one of the first questions I asked myself when I learned about bioenergy. And it's this concept that, plants take up carbon dioxide, but then if we turn them into biofuels, the fuel gets burned, you release carbon dioxide. So they're not really carbon negative. At best, they would be carbon neutral because you're not adding more carbon like you do with fossil fuels when you turn really old carbon into carbon dioxide. So how are biofuels actually helping our situation with changing climate and carbon dioxide? And I have Ali, you can go ahead and answer first.
So the way that I think about this question is it's really a matter of thinking once that carbon dioxide is taken in by the plant during photosynthesis, kind of what the ultimate outcome is. So what's the eventual fate of that carbon? And we do know that there's a portion of that carbon that's taken out of the atmosphere and that goes into plant biomass. And that once that is harvested, that is either eventually burned and either released as carbon dioxide again, or if it's connected to carbon capture technology, then it can be collected. However, we also have a very significant portion of that carbon that's taken in by the plants that is transferred into the soils below ground. And that's either as plant litter. So when those above ground tissues senesce, they fall to the ground, those can be processed by fungi and bacteria and other small organisms that are living down in the soil. But even more so, especially with our second generation biofuel crops, such as switchgrass and miscanthus and some of those other perennial grasses and woody crops we've mentioned in some other introductions. A lot of that is going down below into the root system, and that carbon is really forming a really important pool of carbon that can then be stabilized by either being held really closely up against soil particles where it can degrade decomposition, or it's being processed in those soil food webs. So as decomposed organisms are continuing to feed on that carbon and it's being moved throughout the food web, there are portions of that that get stabilized. So That's really the carbon that we're looking for, and we're trying to understand what the ultimate fate is, because soils really hold the biggest reservoir of terrestrial carbon that we have. So making sure that the carbon we're putting into soils and stays down there, that's going to be a really big goal of bioenergy, is to try to maximize that as best as possible.
Go ahead, Phil. Thank you, Ali.
Yeah, Ali has it absolutely right. I just want to add that if the CO2 that's emitted is the same CO2 that was captured a year previous, then there's no net change in atmospheric CO2. And that's the basis for bioenergy being a fossil fuel CO2 avoidance strategy. Now, the negative emissions comes in, as Ali pointed out, when that part of that carbon is either stored in the soil, locked in the soil as organic matter over long periods of time, or is captured and transported to geologic reservoirs. So Adriana, your notion of it's being mainly a CO2 avoidance strategy is correct in the absence of storage. So.
Thank you, Phil. Anyone wants to add anything? If I think this was really good, extensive answer. So thank you both for that. We'll now move to a first question in Q&A. And I think Tyler will be a good person to start with that one, but it is, how involved in the bioenergy, biofuels conversations are farmers? Are there farmer groups involved in GLBRC? And are there active conversations happening between farmers and researchers? And I will add on, there was some questions in chat as well about growing. We need land to grow food, and we don't need land to grow fuel right now. So maybe answering from that aspect of conversation with farmers, and then conversation with farmers about actually growing also these grasses or other crops that could be turned into biofuels.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at it. Those are both really good, great questions, but big, broad questions as well. On the farmer side, certainly there's farmers being involved in the discussion, but it's a really critical component. And some of the earlier research in GLBRC, but other research centers as well, historically, by economists and others who go out and survey and interact with these farmers, have tried to gauge what the willingness to adopt new crops are. And it's a challenge. It's farmers are already really, I've heard them described as risk saturated, right? They have to take on a lot of risk, and trying a new crop or a new production system is an additional risk on top of that. But the opportunities I think that bioenergy can offer mean it might still be a very possible and feasible thing, but certainly looking at these strategies and implementation mechanisms needs to happen hand in hand with producer groups and producers and farmers to really gain those insights about what the challenges are on the ground and how we would incorporate bioenergy systems into their current production systems as well. So it's definitely something that I think is in the forefront of a lot of the research, at the same time as while the technical research is going on in the background of how to better refine a fuel and things like that. So it has to go really hand in hand, these socioeconomic questions and concepts with the technical studies. And just briefly on the food versus fuel questions, that's also a really important one, and it falls on that whole social acceptance side and making sure that the net benefits and outcomes of bioenergy systems are really desirable from not only a climate standpoint, but from biodiversity and water quality and wildlife habitat and just overall net societal benefits. And so a lot of the research in GLBRC has been focused on sustainability right from the start. So keeping that potential conflict and competition between land uses in mind. And because of that, some of the types of systems that have been studied and looked at are really specifically designed to try to minimize or avoid that food versus fuel conflict. And we already use a large chunk of land for corn-based ethanol. And so a lot of the potential next generation bioenergy systems that are being researched and developed right now look at how maybe we could switch over that intensive annual cropping system to something that's a little less intensive, more perennial, and could actually restore a lot of natural benefits to the landscape. And so it's really, all this research is typically done with those types of interactions and overall competitions in mind, just to figure out how we can potentially design a really optimal and overall beneficial system.
Thank you. That's a great answer to, like you said, to very broad and complicated question. Would anyone like to add anything on that? At any time, feel free to chime in, any of our panelists. With that,
Adriana, I'm happy to jump in just for a second.
Sure.
If you don't mind. So I just want to comment on the farmers. I think, most farmers and therefore farmer groups are taking quite logically a wait and see attitude with respect to bioenergy. They're incredibly interested, as you might expect, because this represents a potential income stream that, would not, if we do it right, would not impact their ability to grow crops on their arable land. But frankly, because there's no market, it's hard to get folks to think about it very seriously. And that said, we are keeping farmer interests in mind. We do have extension agronomists working in the GLBRC who are in very close contact with farmers and farmer organizations. And a lot of the cropping systems we're designing are designed to be amenable to actual uptake by farmers. I mean, it's not going to do anyone any good to design a system that farmers will eschew. And so we do think a lot about how farmers are going to react to the systems we're designing.
Thank you, Phil. Our next question is, given how many green areas are in suburbs and some in urban areas, has any work on bioenergy been done on lawn grasses that, like we see in urban or suburban systems? And basically asking, can school districts, campuses, or parks get involved in this process of creating biofuels from crops?
I'll just
Sounds
start.
like another land use question.
Yeah, probably will know more about this, but I mean, there is a lot of lawn and turf grass in the United States, and there have been efforts to try to quantify that. I don't know offhand if it's been looked at for bioenergy potential. I feel like somebody told me about this a year or two ago, and we looked into it, and I can't remember what we ended up thinking or finding. One thing that comes into mind as sort of a corollary is people have looked at, can you use the ditches on the sides of roads or right-of-ways along freeways and things like that? And one of the challenges of harvesting that type of grass or vegetation along roadsides is contamination from the roadway. So salt and other debris from the roadway also can often contaminate that. But as far as turf grass and lawns, it is a huge underutilized resource in the US and globally. And people have certainly started thinking about it as an opportunity to rewild or add some wildlife habitat to urban and suburban areas, as well as growing food through urban agriculture. And so one thing is, even if you couldn't use those directly, there's probably some issues with transportation and having economies of scale. Certainly they could be interesting for research purposes, as I think the question person put forward. Could schools be involved in some of the research and growing these, but also potentially in offsetting or displacing or creating food so that we wouldn't need that much cropland to grow food. If we're producing more food in our urban and suburban areas, could that then free up some additional land for extra conservation or bioenergy crop production?
Thank you, Tyler. Cheyenne?
I just wanted to add to Tyler and the question as well. And as I can see from the chat, yes, the youth do want to help. And I've had the opportunity to mentor many different interns over the course of my research who've come from many different disciplines: engineering, education, community sustainability, and geography. And each of them have approached research to bioenergy in very different, unique ways, which has opened my eyes into ways that the community can also interact with the research in bioenergy, such as public outreach. Many of students have been interested in, one, understanding how the sensors work, understanding how they can use and retrieve information. And at public outreach events that we did at Grandparents University at University of Wisconsin, we were able to engage the public in being able to understand what is albedo and how it can be used in their own backyard.
Thank you, Cheyenne. That's a really great point. And yeah, we're always happy to work with educators or students. So feel free to reach out to us, and we'll have contact information at the end too. Yeah, we always want to share our knowledge and get youth involved in this research and in science in general. Moving on to the next question is on, when discussing agriculture and bioenergy, are microbes and fungi included? So I know this isn't everyone's on here expertise, but I think, yeah, Carmella could chime in on that for sure.
Sure, that's such a great question. And I mean, I think we are trying to think about these microbial fungal communities. We know that there are fungi that form really close associations with some of these perennial bioenergy crops like switchgrass, and that can be really important for water and phosphorus acquisition. And we know that there are nitrogen fixing microbes that are also associated with switchgrass and other perennial crops in the soil. And really why this is important is because we're thinking about really harnessing the natural power of grasslands to fuel society. And that means the microbial, bacterial, fungal communities. And if we can sort of do that, then we can ensure that these crops are more sustainable than fossil fuels, right? So we can understand, for example, what I study is nitrogen fixation. If we can understand when this process is occurring and we can maximize it, then we can reduce or even eliminate fertilizer use. And not only is that important for a farmer's bottom line, but it's also environmentally friendly, right? We know that nutrient pollution can cause algal blooms in our waterways, and it can also increase greenhouse gas emissions, which cause more climate warming. So I think that if we can really, again, learn more about these communities, that really is the key to the sustainability of these systems.
Thank you, Carmella. Yeah, and go ahead, Ali.
I was going to say, I'll just chime in real quick also. I think when we're thinking about the importance of bioenergy and biofuels from a carbon perspective, especially with the goal of becoming carbon neutral or even carbon negative, the microbial component in these bioenergy cropping systems are a really crucial part of that, not only for, they have these close associations with the plants that we need to grow successfully if we want to harness that biomass for energy and fuel. But also we know that when we are trying to keep carbon in the soils so that it's not being sourced out into the atmosphere, we know that microbes, especially fungi, are playing a really critical part in that. They're really important for the long-term storage and stabilization of soil carbon. So once plants have that carbon that goes below ground, below the surface, it's really the microbes that are having a big influence on whether that carbon is staying there for the long term. So there's definitely been a lot of work looking to see kind of how these organisms are functioning and operating in ways that are going to make these bioenergy cropping systems more sustainable in terms of being carbon sinks.
Great, thank you, Ali. Those are great answers. I wanted to go to a question that was submitted before, and this is going back to changing climate. We know that climate is already changing, and some of these changes we can prevent some of the more catastrophic changes, but there's already changes happening, and there are estimates that there's going to be increase in temperatures, especially in Midwest, and increase in droughts as well. So are we looking at that in terms of growing bioenergy crops and how that might affect if the future of bioenergy crops? And then maybe Mauricio can start with that.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a very interesting question, right? We are thinking in new plans, or well, new plans, but new plans for the system that are also, we need to have the plants that are also able to adapt to this changing climate. So we need to get new plants that are also resilient enough. And what is very, very fascinating is that these plants, especially the ones I focus on, the perennial grasses, they're very resilient to all these changes. As I said before, they have a very, very large root system. I've been doing excavations like soil cores that go up to 1 meter, and you see roots all the way down there. So that means that these plants, they have the potential to tap on that deeper layers and still extracting water. So even though, yeah, we're expecting droughts to be more severe and more frequent, these plants have also potential to be more resilient because they can tap to water levels that annual crops, for example, they want. And then for temperature is for the range of temperatures that we are seeing in the future climate. Temperature could be a good thing, especially for perennial grasses because they're well adapted to higher temperatures. And so, but the research we've been doing, and this goes back to the rainfall and the drought events in the future climate, we have these rainout shelters that what we do is basically we put a roof on our plots and we grow these, in my case, is switchgrass, but we have this very big, well, very big, it's like 4 meters by 5 meters. And this is a collaboration we're doing with Carmella, where we just put the shelter, block the superficial rain, and measure what's happening under these shelters. And surprisingly, the physiology of this plant is very resilient, which for me was fascinating. It's not the best when you're trying to get exciting results to talk about them, but for the physiology and nature, it's fascinating how the physiology of the plant remains pretty constant. But even though we see some changes in the final biomass at the end of the growing season, still these plants are doing very well, and probably they could be a very good option when we compare to annual crops.
Thank you, Mauricio. Phil wants to add something. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to what Maury said. We also are using modeling to try to predict what will happen under different climates for these crops. We have crop models that are very good at predicting productivity and carbon storage and partitioning to roots and biomass, for example, under normal climate conditions, and also under conditions where temperature is higher or earlier in the spring, or we get periodic droughts, or we have more intermittent deluges, all of which are, a part of climate change. And one aspect of the research we're doing is trying to validate these models to best understand whether they really are predicting what they're proposing to predict. And we're using these, for example, the rainout shelters that Mauricio described are a great tool for helping us to understand how well the models do. And once we get good models, then we can use the environmental characteristics of any spot in the region to predict what the crop growth will be, what the switchgrass growth will be under different climate scenarios. So that's one way we can extrapolate the research that we're doing at the plot scale to much larger areas.
Thank you, Phil. That actually ties into the other question that was asked, and maybe someone else can elaborate, but attendee asked, presumably there's a lot of uncertainty associated with translating outcomes observed in the lab or in research plots to a broader landscape. How confident can we be that the widespread adoption of cellulosic biofuels will lead to climate positive outcomes? As a corollary, the benefits of corn ethanol seem very uncertain. Some studies say it's better than petroleum, others say it's worse. Anyone wants to take that? Ali, go ahead.
I guess I can just start it off with the first part of the question that is addressing the uncertainty that's associated with how we can kind of scale up these research plot or even site based research studies and what they actually tell us. And I think that they are definitely a piece into a much greater puzzle, which is something that really needs to be addressed once with replicating field studies across different geographies. We know that even with candidate bioenergy crops like switchgrass, if you grow it in one area of the country, you can have much different yield outcomes than if you grow it somewhere else. So I think, having replicated studies across greater areas is going to be a helpful part of that, as well as having long-term studies. So the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, there are field sites that have been having research done on different cropping systems for over 10 years now, and having that data to see how things are changing over time is going to help kind of piece together these different investigations and show us kind of like what the bigger picture is.
Thanks,
And I can just
Ali.
jump
ahead,
in
Tyler.
a little tiny thing. Another way that we aim to address that uncertainty, or one strategy that's been proposed, is to aim for bioenergy feedstocks and systems that are just so far above and beyond the current gasoline that uncertainty isn't as big of an issue. So aim for these next generation crops that offer 100 or 200% greenhouse gas savings relative to baseline. And that way, if there is large uncertainty and we miss and we're above or below any benefits that they have by 50%, it's still going to be a big net benefit. And the example was given with corn ethanol, which is a good example where it's really close, whether or not it's a net benefit or at parity or even worse. And so that uncertainty then is a really big issue, and we don't know how big potential benefits could be or if they're even there at all. But if we aim and set our sights far beyond, then that's one way to help deal with that uncertainty, because we know even if the original is wrong, we're still going in the right direction and it's going to have net benefits.
Go ahead, Phil.
I would simply add to these excellent answers that this is such an important question. This question largely motivated the sustainability research that GLBRC does. The last thing we want is unwelcome surprises in the future when we have systems in place and we learn that in fact they weren't as good as we thought they were, or worse, they could be doing environmental harm. Environmental regret is a terrible thing, and we're trying to avoid it by learning as much as we can about the different sustainability characteristics of these systems so that we can design a system to be as armored as possible against the potentially harmful consequences.
Thank you, Phil. Kind of following from that, there's actually two questions that I think can be put together, but what's more climate effective in long term, planting bioenergy crop or absorbing carbon by ecosystem restoration, or by planting, for example, managed forests? Maybe Cheyenne wants to start with that. I know you've done some work on albedo of different landscapes.
Yes, I'll be happy to answer. With the research that has been done, there has been a definite instance of albedo changing over very different landscapes, from forest to annual row crops to even perennials. And understandably, many people are worried about converting, forests or current, agricultural lands that are being used for financial or community gain for biofuel energy. These areas are very sustainable, and native plants such as switchgrass and native grasses are both tolerant to drought and native to the landscape, and they provide high reflectivity as well as other diversity services. So in analyzing the MOP problem, where different scales can provide different benefits, where you plant biofuel energies, for looking at the local to global scales, understanding how each biofuel crop works on the landscape is extremely critical. Miscanthus, for example, is a perennial which has shown great promise in cool and local landscapes, while other perennials such as switchgrass and restored prairie are native to the Midwest. So they provide diversity and other diversity services which are not available to annual row crops such as corn and sorghum, which are usually planted in May. So these are some good methods in which bioenergy crops not only help mitigate climate warming, but how albedo differs between the different crops and helps moderate the atmospheric temperature at local to global scales.
Thank you, Cheyenne. Anyone would like to add anything to that?
I'll just say briefly, in part of it, it might not have to be an either or, right? So we can use some locations and use them for ecosystem restoration, and potentially down the line then utilize for cellulosic bioenergy. And a lot of maybe the trade-offs of evaluating how to use that land plays out on the time scale that you're looking at. So perhaps immediately in the short term, we could do enhanced restoration, but over the long term, when some of these technologies that Phil was explaining, like carbon capture and storage, come online and widespread available, that really provides or could provide an opportunity for that long-term net negative emissions with bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So in a sense, they could be really complementary uses of land.
Mauricio, did you want to add anything?
No, that's what I was going to say. I think it's not what's the best, or at least how I see it. I think it's all of the above. And some places may not be ideal to plant a forest, but you could have an alternative.
Great. Thank you all. So we're reaching our time, which flew by with this great conversation and with all the great questions. We have some more questions in Q&A. So if anybody, some of the panelists might be able to stick around and just type up some of the answers. But I actually wanted to end with a question that came up, which is more just about what path led you to becoming a scientist, and how did you decide to study bioenergy? Because as mentioned, it's so important to motivate the youth and kind of inspire them to go into research and into science. So what are your stories of getting into bioenergy research? And whoever wants to go first. Maybe Ali, you're.
I can start us off. So I've always been really interested in science, especially with animals. I got my bachelor's in zoology, and I knew that I wanted to continue studying animals and their interactions with plants and other organisms. But growing up as a young person who's really starting to see the effects of climate change more and more, I really was interested in, what kind of impacts are we having on native ecosystems and native animals, and what are the ways we can be mitigating this. So I feel like doing my research in the context of studying bioenergy is really interesting nexus, which allows me to combine those interests of studying the organisms and the life forms that have always really interested me, but in a way that we're not only just trying to see what kind of environmental benefits we could be having, but really what these native organisms' role is in these landscapes. So that's what really kind of drew me into this research field.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Ali. Mauricio?
Yeah, for me, for me, bioenergy gives me this, it kind of meets two criteria. First, I love plants. I think they're fascinating organisms that they don't age, they don't die, they're fantastic. And but it also, through bioenergy, I found my love in plants to also help me do something good for the environment and give farmers opportunities and give other alternatives that they were not there maybe 20, 30, or 50 years ago.
Great. You would be a great spokesperson for plants, Mauricio.
Please do.
Cheyenne?
Yes, I wanted to just briefly add how I became into this field. When I first started in high school, I was very interested in geography. And I remember what jump-started my idea into analyzing spatial and temporal changes of the landscapes was reading up on the Mount St. Helens volcano eruption and how the restoration to both human and economic wise, how they planted one side of the volcano and then allowed the other one to restore naturally, and how those two changes kind of coincide together, but they were so drastically different. And to me, that kind of got me very interested in how to analyze both spatially and temporally changes in the landscape over long periods of time. And I slowly got drawn into remote sensing and hydrology and changes in the landscape. And here I am looking at plants. It was not my first area of coming into the study, but I enjoy looking at how these different plants do change the landscape over long periods of time.
Thank you, Cheyenne. Phil?
Well, I was hoping we'd hear from the younger scientists here first. I'm, at the other end of the scale here, but I'll just summarize. My entry into the biofuels arena came from my desire. Well, it really came from hope, and that as an ecosystem ecologist, I study what happens when ecosystems are disturbed, and particularly agricultural systems. And I was very interested in a potential solution both to climate change as well as to some of the more intractable pollution problems that agriculture has given us. And so I am very hopeful that bioenergy will be part of the grander solution of environmental sustainability looking into the future.
Thanks, Phil. Carmella?
So I'm really passionate about microbial communities, but also I have a growth mindset. So what I did for my PhD was look at methane production in Alaskan wetlands. So a very different environment and context. And so I think it's been really fun to learn about more agricultural systems and just working in a completely different environment with nitrogen instead of carbon. And so just really changing it up. And I think it's been great to work with a lot of the folks on this panel and just learn new things.
Great. Thanks, Carmella. And Tyler?
Thanks. I pretty much just stumbled into it. I've always had interest in big picture questions like how should we use our land to best benefit society and the environment? And that sort of led me to these big US land use questions and bioenergy and how can we potentially use that for net benefit.
Great, thank you all, and thank you for staying a little over time. If you're still answering questions, I will hold on here for 2 minutes. Allison, send in the chat our contact information for email, as well as our website for any future events if you want to learn more about bioenergy. Thank you all so much for being engaged and submitting so many great questions. And thank you so much for our experts to being on this panel and having all these great answers and really having a great conversation tonight. I hope you all have a great rest of your night. And with that, we'll end the event, but I'll stick around for 2 more minutes just to let people finish answering questions. Thank you.